I've actually spoken in this very room with actually almost the same talk. Was anybody at that talk? There was a third of the size of the crowd. So I'm glad that we tripled. That's really lovely. And I want to thank Robin, because Robin is the one who gets me here, and that's the school nurses. I mean, the school nurses, I think you guys know, the school nurse's job is a really hard job. I don't know what other nurse we have in the room, but being a school nurse to 900 plus kids, you have 2 kids who need insulin, and then 10 who need an EpiPen, and somebody who has a PEG tube, and you need 3 nurses in this building. So people like Robin work really hard, and the school nurses around the state have really led the effort on this front. So we're going to talk about the teenage brain, and I am delighted in this room that I have a handful of teenagers. Are you guys students here? Yeah? At the elementary school? Or the middle school? Okay. So I got a handful. So we're going to talk about brain development, and we're going to talk about, in big picture ways, the way the brain breaks down with addiction. The reward center of the brain involves 3 areas: the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, and the prefrontal cortex. And it is this part of the brain that is disrupted with all addiction. Whether it's a sugar addiction, a struggle with marijuana, alcohol, it always goes to this part of the brain. And this part of the brain tells you to survive. It tells you to get up every morning, find clean water, good food, and find a mate. Because the entire purpose of everybody in this room is to survive long enough that you could pass your genetic material forward. That is your purpose. You don't know that's your purpose on a day-to-day basis, yet it is your purpose. Evolutionarily speaking, that's the reason we're here. And these empty seats had ancestors that weren't good at making this happen. Your ancestors were very good at making this happen. It's why we exist. So this reward circuit of the brain is the most ancient, elemental part of the brain. It is what makes you survive. That part of the brain mostly interacts with dopamine. There's some other receptors that are also part of this very complicated system. I spend no time talking about serotonin, which is the mood issue, sleep, cognition, but I'm going to spend all my time on dopamine here. Dopamine gives you the sense of euphoria and deep pleasure, and that was awesome, I'm doing it again. It also has 2 behaviors associated with it: perseveration and compulsion. And again, you wanted to perseverate about clean water in your next meal. You needed to be compulsive about it. It's the last thing you thought of before you went to bed, the first thing you thought of in the morning. How am I going to survive, and how am I going to protect my young? Those are awesome behaviors when it comes to survival. But apply those 2 behaviors to addiction, right? Anybody in the medical field in the room? Work in the ER, right? Those behaviors are what you see walking into your ER again and again and again with addiction. And you think to yourself, pull yourself up by the bootstraps and get over this. But again, the part of the brain that breaks with addiction is this part of the brain, the survival part of the brain. So it's the worst part of the brain to actually break down, right? If I could move all addiction to like the visual cortex or the auditory canal, and you lost your peripheral vision, or you lost your high-pitched sound, addiction would be a piece of cake to take care of, right? It would be the easiest disease to take care of, and instead it's not that part of the brain. So some of us at a baseline are happy-go-lucky, glass half full, high dopamine people. I'm lucky I'm one of those people. My dopamine levels sit at about 108. On average, we're all sitting at about 100. Do I have a way to measure your dopamine? Not really. It's not a blood test. It's not a PET scan test. For illustrative purposes, we're going to say we're all at 100, and people like me get to be lucky at 108 or 106. There are many people in the world who walk into my office every day who sit at an 85 or 90. Just baseline low dopamine, glass half empty. There's nothing I'm going to do to get you to change. You're one of those Eeyores of the world. They're exhausting. I have them in my own family. I'm very familiar with them. And that is sort of luck of the draw, genetics, and likely some epigenetics at play here. So the way that dopamine works when it comes to surviving is you get a spike in dopamine when June comes, and you find that perfect Western Mass June strawberry, and you bite into it and you think, holy smokes, that's a strawberry. I haven't had a strawberry really in a full year, because those things we get out of Northern California all winter long aren't real strawberries. They're disgusting tasting, right? So you get a spike in dopamine. Your dopamine will go to 150. Your brain says that was good. Let's go back to that. You have sex. It's consensual. It's awesome. Your dopamine spikes to 200, and then it goes back to normal. You have cocaine in your system, your dopamine will spike to about 350. If you use and get euphoric with any pill prescription opiate, your dopamine will go to 500. If you're using an injectable opiate, whether it's heroin or fentanyl, your dopamine may go to 900 or 1,000. And with crystal methamphetamine, your dopamine levels go between 1,200 and 1,300. So that is an amazing level of dopamine. And the real question is, why aren't we doing that more often? Because that seems like a great idea, right? Who wouldn't want something that's 6 or 8 times the perfect strawberry or the flourless chocolate cake or sex, right? Like, why wouldn't you want to do that? It's not sustainable. That's the answer, right? It doesn't keep working that way. Let's talk about the way certain drugs work. There's a math equation when it comes to dopamine. It's how much you produce, how many receptors are on the other side receiving the information, and how many little vacuums are sucking dopamine out of the synaptic cleft. Those are the 3 things that affect how much dopamine there is. The way cocaine works is it turns off the little vacuum. Makes all the vacuums break down, so all that dopamine sitting in the synaptic cleft being active. Cocaine has this most straightforward approach to how it works. The way heroin works is slightly more complicated because it goes through a negative feedback system before it goes to a positive system. But at the end of the day, all it does is push more dopamine out. It makes more dopamine go into this active area. You can walk through every addictive pathway and substance and figure out the way that it makes more dopamine or makes more dopamine active and available to you. So the problem is that when your brain is seeing dopamine levels of 350, 500, 900, it says, holy smokes, what's going on here? Because for the 200,000 years that we have been in this form on this planet, you don't see dopamine levels like that. That's not normal. That's not natural. That's not in keeping with evolution. And instead, the brain says something's wrong. The volume is way too loud. I need to turn it down. I'm going to stop making dopamine. I'm going to erase 80% of my receptors, and I'm going to create 20 times more vacuum. I'm going to suck all the dopamine out. So instead of returning time and time again to your new baseline of 85, if that's where you started, after exposing your brain to a substance that's addictive over a period of time, and that period of time could be 4 weeks or 3 months, your new baseline dopamine is like 40. Right? You're in the toilet every single day. It is hard to get out of bed, get showered, and pour a bowl of cereal when you're sitting at a 40. There's nobody in the room who was at 40 because you couldn't be sitting in this room at a 40. And the problem is that your new baseline level of dopamine is really not in keeping with living a nice, normal, full life. And in order to feel normal, you have to keep using that drug or drinking. You're desperate to feel normal. For those of us who've struggled with addiction or have family members that struggle with addiction or take care of people, they're long away from feeling high anymore. They don't get any euphoria. And they're not just chasing a drug sickness. They are chasing feeling normal again. They would give anything to get themselves back to a dopamine of 85 or 100. That's why people continue to use. It is a terrible vicious cycle, and it's extremely hard to break. So, having said all of what I just said, I recognize that I just gave a fairly simple overview of how addictive substances break the brain. It is really complicated. It does involve other neurotransmitters. There's a ton of awesome articles for those neuroscientists in the world who really want to delve in deep. I'm all in favor of you doing that, and I can give you citations that might help you. As people now live in this area of a dopamine of 40 or 50 or 60, sometimes they get a long period of sobriety, and maybe over a long period of time, and we're going to talk about at the end, if I don't remember to really talk about it, that dopamine receptors do get better, things get better, but it takes distance away from the addictive substance, and it's a long distance. It's not 5 days in detox or 30 days in rehab. That's a drop in the bucket. That is a tiny first step where you get yourself up for air so you can really make a real plan, right? Yet that's what we offer everybody. Hey, you, 5 days in rehab, you'll be fine. Yeah, not so much. So it leads you to this concept of a broken brain. What I think about this is that this is a broken brain that heals. The same way that bones get broken and get better, lots of people with addiction can get better, but so often we don't offer them the right treatment. So I just want to remind people about diabetes and the way diabetes works. So type 1, so the real normal people who don't have diabetes, you have a pancreas that makes insulin. Insulin forces blood sugar into a cell. Type 1 diabetics, they don't make the insulin. So the chemical that's telling your cells to suck in the glucose isn't there. Type 2 diabetes, actually, it's the insulin receptor that's broken. So this has to do with a system where there's a messaging system, there's a production of something, there's a receptor on the other side, and one or the other gets broken, right? So how is that any different than what I just described with addiction? Any different? Okay. So tell me then why this happened at Cooley Dick this morning. Because it did, because it happens at every hospital, anywhere. I'm not just picking on Cooley Dick. I could have said my hospital, Bay State Franklin Hospital. I work at both hospitals, or I'm on staff there, so I'm not targeting any hospital. I just know the way every ER in our country works. So this guy up there is 66 years old, and he has crushing substernal chest pain. And he makes a phone call from Whately, And the ambulance is there. Actually, he doesn't. His wife does. He says, no, I'm fine. Don't call the ambulance. So 911 comes. They have an EKG hooked up to him. That gets transmitted electronically to Cooley Dick ER instantly. He has an IV in. He's given IV morphine, a beta blocker under the tongue, an aspirin. He gets lots of nitroglycerin, and by the time he's en route to Cooley Dick calls that truck and says, don't even bother bringing him here. He's having a massive interior MI. Bring him straight down to Bay State. The guy needs bypass. Heads down to Bay State, gets quadruple bypass. He's in the cardiac care unit for 4 or 5 days. He's on the floor for 7 more days. He's a social work consult because he's going to be depressed, because all men post-MI are depressed. He's set up with an outpatient therapist, cardiac rehab. He gets to see me as primary care doctor. He is a new cardiologist, right? How much did that cost us? A lot of money, right? That's not a $5,000 workup right there. Maybe that's $100,000. Actually, that much bypass surgery, that could have been $250,000. It's a lot. So that young woman there lives next door to him in Whately. She's 24 years old. She's a known opiate use disorder. Her mom knows this. Her mom has Narcan at the house. Mom bangs on that bathroom door. She doesn't respond. Mom bursts in, calls 911, administers Narcan. She's not yet arousable. 911 ambulance arrives. They give her more Narcan. In Whately, actually, the police get there first. They carry Narcan on them. They're the first, second responders. They are administering it. By the time she gets to Cooley Dick ER, she's wide awake and mad, right? Because she feels rotten now. We just sent her to active withdrawal and saved her life. What's offered for her in the ER? I mean, really, what is offered? Something, not nothing.
An urgent psych eval.
That's high end, but yes, if they're really lucky, she may have gotten an urgent psych eval, right? But is she suicidal?
Probably not.
Probably not. So they're not admitting her, and there's no psych beds anyway. There's no psychiatrist actually either. So that was an amazing thought, though. I love it. She was probably given some counseling by somebody who was crabby and sick of seeing her, because that wasn't probably her first overdose. And she was given a brochure with some telephone numbers to call. Start calling. I know you're sick. I know you're feeling terrible. I should know that your dopamine level's 40. But why don't you go sit on the phone for the next 48 hours and try to find yourself some treatment out there on this planet? So let's go back to him, okay? We didn't talk about his background, right? He's a 2-pack-a-day smoker. He hasn't actually seen me in my primary care office in the last 3 years, even though he has known high blood pressure and diabetes. Both of his parents had anterior wall MIs in their 50s, early MIs, strong family history. He eats at Wendy's 3 times a week. His body mass index is 37. He carries way too much weight on him, right? Every part of his current disease picture had to do with something he created. And in fact, a lot of which had to do with addiction, right? He's addicted to nicotine. He's likely addicted to fat and sugar. Right? We could say that. But nobody said, hey, you've done a terrible job of taking care of yourself. In fact, you created this hot mess that you're in. Nobody wagged their finger at him. Instead, we offered him the absolute best medicine that you can find in this great country of ours, without any question. The likelihood of her dying at 30, 60, and 90 days at the age of 24 is far greater than the likelihood of him dying. Yet we didn't give her a chance at all. Because what did we do instead? We shamed her, we blamed her, we had no recognition of this disease of addiction, and we didn't, in an ER setting, think, what can I actually do to help those people with addiction to try to get better? You know what? I'm fine on shaming and blaming him, but just start judging everybody equally, right? Wouldn't that go over well? Because the truth is, the vast majority of the diseases that I take care of every day are somewhat self-created. They really are. There's some genetics at play, I get that part. But there's a lot of people I take care of who eat terribly, who don't exercise, who don't do the very long list of things that I magically think will make them better, because it's really hard to have a chronic disease or depression or anxiety or not be able to afford good food, right? Or working 3 shifts a day just to survive. And of course you're not going to the gym like that, right? But instead we treat some people with a lot of empathy and sympathy and other things, and there's a lot of other people we don't. It's this mismatch that happens in medicine that makes me crazy. Okay, so let's talk a little bit again about the dopamine. I said there's no blood test to measure it. The PET scans are measuring dopamine, and on these slides what you see is these bright orange areas are areas of high dopamine activity. That middle column is a normal brain. Those are most of us in this room who have good dopamine. When you look at that right column, you can see under cocaine, not much dopamine. The next one is meth, really not a healthy brain and definitely no dopamine. Alcohol, I want you to note the amount of orange with alcohol. And then the final one is somebody who's using heroin. The point of this slide from my perspective is I want us to acknowledge something, and we're going to dive back in on alcohol. Alcohol is the #1 drug of abuse in our society, and it causes a huge amount of harm to us as individuals, to families, and to society. And to not pay a lot of attention to alcohol, and you guys just talked about the role that alcohol has in many young people's lives in Amherst and in Northampton. The wheels come off the bus with alcohol a lot later, right? Families fall apart a lot later. You can be a functional alcoholic for quite a long time before you got your third OUI, lost your license, lost your job, and your husband walked out on you. It takes a while. And that's because dopamine gets disrupted later in the system. So let's talk about the things that put any one of us, and in particular our kids, at risk of developing an addiction. And I'm not going to say this is hard science. This is what sort of a compilation of what is known out there. So the first one is genetics, the second one is early exposure, and the third one is trauma. The fourth is poor mental health. And the question with poor mental health is what comes first? You know, genetics plays a role in poor mental health. Do kids start smoking marijuana because they're anxious and they need it to sleep or to function? Or does using marijuana early then create anxiety, right? That one of early exposure versus mental health issues goes both directions. And there's no doubt with the issue of trauma, poor mental health has a very big role. Trauma causes extremely poor mental health. So genetics plays a huge role in addiction, and in fact, genetics accounts for 50% of it. There are very few other diseases out there of anything you could tell me that has this kind of genetics. Very rare, but yet people say to me, I have a genetic history of breast cancer, and I'm like, I hear you say that, but most breast cancers arise from nothing, with no genetic history, right? And in fact, unless you have truly specific kinds of infrequently seen genes, you know, you're at sort of normal risk. So the point here is that if you have a parent or a grandparent who has an addiction, you have a 50% chance of having that. And so who needs to know that information in your family? Your children need to know that information in your family, because your kids don't get to decide anything about their genetics. And talking about their genetic risk gives them the information they need in order for them to make good decisions, because they get to affect one of these three things, which is when they decide their first use is going to be. Okay, so addiction is a developmental pediatric disease. Do I have any pediatricians, pediatric nurse practitioners, anybody like that in the room? I would not say that the average family medicine or pediatric residency taught this way, but when I sit in a room of 100 pediatricians, they're all like, yep, this is a pediatric developmental disease. Wish I'd actually learned more about it that way. All addiction starts while the brain is developing. If you have your first exposure to a cigarette, to alcohol, to any addictive substance after the age of 25 or 26, you will not get addicted. You just will not get addicted. The rates of that is like 2% or lower. And I think those people are sort of coming up with their real truth on it. It is the exposure while the brain is developing, so under the age of 24 or 25. And for those of us, again, who have struggled with addiction or have it in our family, I ask the question all the time, how old were you when you had your first exposure, and was it, and I throw out the easy ones, alcohol, cigarettes, or marijuana. Those are the easy, most likelies. How old were you? And the answers that come back are always starting around here. I was 12 or 13. Those are very normal numbers. When I ask that question at the jail, I'm a medical director at Franklin County House of Corrections, and I can ask 120 guys in a room, and I'll say first age of exposure, and I start at 12. Every hand's up at 12. And I'm like 11, 10, 9? Hands are starting to drop. 8, 7, 6. I have hands in the air at the age of 6 years old. Right, that's a first grader. And that for me, you know, when I give talks like that at the jail, I'm actually traumatized afterwards because it's so distressing to me. But so now I'm the medical director at a detox and addiction treatment, and we ask this question, and the numbers are all the same, but I get hugely low numbers. So my point is that for those of you who have a 5th or a 6th or 7th grader at home, right, you have got to be thinking to yourself that these are ages when kids first get their exposure. Now, in the old days, our parents and grandparents used to leave packs of cigarettes around the house, right? Isn't that true? These days, very few of us smoke. I don't know what the rates in Amherst are of smoking. My guess is they're pretty low, but we have the lowest rates of cigarette smoking in the history after 1900 of the United States. That's a great thing. Cigarettes cost a lot of money. It's been a huge public health measure, and fewer people smoke. So there's fewer packs of cigarettes lying about for kids to take. And in fact, congratulations to our kids in so many ways. The truth is most kids do not smoke cigarettes. The numbers have never, ever been lower. It's 5.6% of high school seniors are using paper cigarettes. Awesome. That's a great thing. They are using a lot more e-cigarettes and vaping products that have nicotine in them. I'm going to talk about that. Okay, so if you are a 15-year-old kid and you start drinking, and drinking here is defined as 2 drinks a week, right? Not kicking back a 12-pack on a Friday night. 2 drinks a week at the age of 15. 40% of those kids go on to be alcoholics. If you wait until the age of 21, 7% go on to be alcoholics. Think about a 21-year-old and a 15-year-old. There's a chasm there, right? Those are like 2 different beings altogether. But in terms of brain development, there is a huge distance between those 2 ages as well. And what I will say to the kids sitting in front of me, and I take care of both their parents, so I actually know their genetic risk. I know dad's in jail with me at the jail for heroin abuse, and the mom is struggling with alcohol use, and I have that 14-year-old. I say, love, this is what I know about you. And you know it too, because we've talked about it before. You are the kid who actually has to have their first exposure to alcohol, marijuana, or nicotine as late as possible in the game. You are the kid at 17 who really can't go to the after football party and drink. You just can't, because it will put you at such higher risk. When they overlay genetics on top of this kind of graph, and they look at kids whose parents, one or the other, have addiction, it almost gets canceled out altogether if you wait until after the age of 21. It is why your kids need to know about their genetic risk of addiction. If you're in recovery from something, your kids need to know that too. Because you're in recovery doesn't change your genetics, right? So this is the thing our kids get to control. And that 14-year-old sitting in front of me in my office nods her head and says, I don't ever want my life to turn out for me or my kids like it has for my parents. So you will repeat this to me every time I see you, but my goal is actually I am going to stay away from this stuff as long as possible, if ever, right? Okay. So, I actually forgot I had the slide in there. So this is the one that shows the genetics on top of when you have your first exposure. Okay, so again, I said it, cigarettes have never been lower. It's fabulous. I'm very proud of our teenagers. I'm proud of our adults who quit, because that's a terrible thing to quit. But marijuana has gone up. And why has it gone up? Because perceived risk has gone down. So I'm not going to target my great teenagers in the room, but we're all going to put ourselves into the under 25 brain. What do we know from the under 25-year-olds out there about marijuana? What do they tell us?
Not addictive.
Absolutely not addictive. Everything I'm about to say is not a fact, in my opinion. I'm repeating what I'm being told by 25-year-olds. Absolutely not addictive. What else? It's definitely not as bad as alcohol. Yep. What else?
I drive better.
I drive better. I'm a slower, more cautious driver. Absolutely. What else?
Wrong that it's illegal.
Yeah, not only is it wrong that it's illegal, but it's legal now. It's legal everywhere. You can just walk outside and smoke a joint outside the library right now. What else?
Doctors prescribe it, but would be okay.
Yeah, doctors prescribe it. In fact, not only is it okay, but it cures everything. It fixes all seizures, all cancers. I'm going to go off all my other medicine. I'm just going to use marijuana. Great. What else?
It doesn't lead to stronger drugs.
It's not a gateway drug. Yep, it does not do that. Yep. What else?
Natural?
It's natural, it's organic, it grows in the backyard. It must be safe and good. Wow. What was the last one?
You did it.
Oh, you know what? You guys are the first group that said that one ever. That's a good one, though. Yeah, you did it. Your whole generation was smoking tons of pot. And look, you're fine, right? Nice. You guys just ran the whole list, I think. Nice. Okay, so big breath, we're going to talk about brain development. So we used to think that all teenage brains were done growing at the age of 12, right? Just done. And probably we used to think they were done in utero, right? They're not, by age 1, they're as physically big as they're ever going to be. The truth is there are 3 critical things that happen between the ages of 12 and 24. So this time that's in this building, the time that is actually down at UMass right now, critical things are happening. The first one is synaptic refinement. The brain has tens of billions of synapses, way more than anybody needs. And in fact, keeping every one of those synapses is actually creates an unhealthy brain. People with major psychiatric illness, schizophrenia, psychosis often have synapses firing everywhere, not ordered thinking. So you need to prune back your brain. And during the teenage years, this 12 to 24 phase, you're getting rid of stuff you don't need. You're pruning it back. There are minutes during adolescence that could happen weeks on end where you're losing 30,000 synapses a minute. A minute, right? It'd be really awesome if you were hanging out with your friends playing Monopoly and having hot cocoa while that was happening. You were in a loving, positive relationship. You were doing good things, right? Sometimes when my own teenagers at home are acting like crazy people, I think they're pruning back their brains. I try to think that way, right? I try not to start yelling at them, but I think there's something happening in this brain that's really important right now. So the second thing that happens during this phase is myelination, or the insulating of the pathway. So here we are cutting back stuff we don't want, we want to get rid of, and then we're creating these pathways that are going to be the highways that we want our kids to go on. And you want these pathways that are the fast-moving, efficient pathways to be the right ones and not the wrong ones. We don't get to choose that, but the behaviors and the exposures our kids have is what is selecting for this. So it goes from totally disorderedness to a nice highway system. The third component is the laying down of receptors in the final shell, or the final cortex of the brain. And the two major receptors that get laid down here are dopamine, which we talked about, right? We remembered how critical that one is. And then a receptor called anandamide. Anandamide is the receptor that is the mirror image of THC, which is the psychoactive ingredient, the cannabinoid that's in marijuana. You cannot tell the difference between those two things, and sadly, neither can the brain. So here we have this critical receptor getting laid down in the final outer cortex of the brain, and THC comes in like a sledgehammer and knocks it out and exerts itself in its spot. So THC really disrupts the process of laying down receptors, and what anandamide, this mirror image of THC is it makes the decisions. It's one of the things that makes the decision about what gets pruned and what gets myelinated. What? Who knew that, right? I didn't know that 2 years ago. I can tell you nobody ever taught me this. I didn't learn this in medical school. The truth is it's a relatively newly discovered neuroreceptor. We don't know a hell of a lot about THC. We really don't. And why is that? Because we can't study it in this country, right? It's a Schedule I drug. The only thing you can study with federal dollars is the stuff that's growing at University of Mississippi since 1970, and I could tell you, what they're growing there is not even remotely related to what they're growing in Franklin County and my kids are using in their school. So I wouldn't study it, even if somebody gave me a big grant to do it. It's not the same product. Consequently, we have a lack of knowledge that runs really deep when it comes to marijuana and what it does to the adolescent brain. Most of the data we have, most of the studies we have come out of New Zealand and Australia, where they actually have been running good studies since the 1970s. And one of the better known studies is called the Dunedin study. And they followed kids from early teenagers all the way up for a long time, 35 years. Oh, not that long, 25 years, till they were 38 to 40 years old. And what it showed is that if you started using marijuana at the age of 13 or 15, which is the normal time to start using marijuana, in fact, the average age of first start in this state is 12.8, age 12.8. I don't want you guys to hear you're running behind. You're not running behind. You're great. But 12.8 is an early age, right? Who's a 12.8? Is that a 7th grader? Yeah, that's a 7th grader. So in this study, looking at 13 to 15-year-olds that followed them over 25 years and asked the question, how are you guys doing? And it looked at them every 5 years. So, but by age 38, there was an 8-point drop in IQ, and there was a very high measure of, wow, I didn't get to be what I wanted to be when I grew up. I'm not doing. A strong sense of life dissatisfaction for those who used marijuana early in teenage versus those who did not. So again, one study, no data out there, that's what we know. One of the other, and it showed lower high school completion, lower going to university. The problem with that study, one, it's tiny-ish. I mean, it was big for what it is. There's just, I need 100 studies looking at this because it's a critical issue, is it's done on the 70s, 80s, and 90s marijuana, right? In 1970, 80, and 90, the marijuana was running between 1% and 2.5% THC. That's what we used, right? The stuff was hardly strong at all. Today's field-grown marijuana is running between 9% and 16% THC. So it's running 10 times higher than the stuff that we are basing our any information on. So I can guarantee you that there's not an IQ increase with more THC in the product, right? I can guarantee you that much. The question is, you have an 8-point drop in IQ. What if you had a 16-point drop in IQ? What if we lost a generation or 2 or 3 to sitting on the couch and eating Cheetos? So today's marijuana out of my fields in Northfield, Massachusetts is running 9% to 16%. And the problem is that then it gets altered to any one of these forms. So the average 35 and older in the room, do you even recognize what this stuff is, and would you know how to use it? Okay, and if I put a nice fat rolled joint in front of the average 18-year-old, they wouldn't know what that was. Okay? This stuff up here has been concentrated in ways that are now ranging, and there's a variety of names for this. Earwax is one of them. Shatter is one of them. In this picture, those hash oil capsules, this stuff is ranging between 40% and 100% THC. That is how concentrated it has been made through, forcing butane and other chemicals through it to get the THC out. This is what our kids are being exposed to, right? Incredibly potent stuff. And look at the number of ways you can get marijuana into your body now, right? Millions of ways. You can eat it, you can drink it, you can smoke it in many, many variations, and you can just take it as a pill or a spray. It's sprayed on gummy bears. It's used in 1,000 different ways now. Then we go to places like Colorado and just start to do a marijuana shopping expedition. So has anybody done any marijuana tourism in Colorado just to check it out? Anybody? Have you been to Colorado? What did it look like to you?
It looked, not much different from that picture. It was, an entire case of different candies and chocolate bars and other really brownies and other looking things that looked terribly.
Like a kid's candy store. Right, like something that really is targeted and marketed towards kids. Because if you're dying of AIDS or you have cancer cachexia, you're not popping in a gummy bear. That's not what you're doing, right? When you get a medical marijuana certificate from me at the local dispensary in Northampton, that's not what's being offered to you, right? But these stores, were there 2 stores in Colorado?
More than that.
Right. There are more marijuana dispensaries in Colorado than there are Starbucks. There are billboards everywhere. The economy in Colorado is all about marijuana and getting it out. And I don't think Colorado meant to be this state, but they are that state. And lots of people now travel to Colorado to come get their marijuana, and there's a huge black market that then buys the stuff and then spreads it all over the country. So we have on our ballot, in just days practically away, ballot 4, which is a yes or no on full recreational use of marijuana. And I'm not a public official, so I can give you whatever opinion I want, but I'm going to remind you that this is a lot of money that's at stake here. Big marijuana is an industry that is betting billions of dollars on this. And we had another industry that did this to us once. Back in the 1600s and 1700s and 1800s, tobacco is a natural North American plant, and our native people were using tobacco for rituals. They weren't smoking the equivalent of 3 packs a day. They may have used tobacco a couple times a week or a couple times a month. Because what happened in the year 1900, when tobacco became an industrialized product and the money began to take over, is they began to plant really more and more potent tobacco that was more intense, with more nicotine in it. And then they began to formulate it in new ways to get it delivered into your system as intensively as possible. And then they added more chemicals, so you got really addicted. Right? That's the way it ran. In the year 1900, less than 1% of Americans used tobacco. By the year 1950, 50% of us used tobacco. We were heavily addicted. The number 1 killer in this country is tobacco. That has been true for 70 years. The number 1 killer. And we're about to hand over to an industry that is all about making money. And in fact, when you do their economic evaluation, the only way they're going to make enough money is to really base themselves in getting the 21s and under addicted. And for those people, that first one of it's not an addictive substance, on the old marijuana, 9 to 13% of people got addicted to marijuana. Tell me about what it means in the new marijuana. When you look at kids' exposure to marijuana these days, this incredibly potent stuff, the estimates are between 40 and 60% will get actually addicted to it, right? That is a problem for the generation that is in this school right now and the generation to follow them. I have no interest in repeating what big tobacco did to us as a country. But right now, ballot 4 looks like it's going to win. I don't know what to say about it. We should be having this talk in this forum in every single school, in every single town, and everybody in the state should have this level of knowledge. It's extremely worrisome. Okay, we said this already. Cigarettes are way down. I'm so proud of that. What is up? E-cigarettes, right? And the problem is when you ask the average teenager what they're vaping, they're like, I don't know, watermelon bubblegum flavored oil. And you're like, well, we have no idea what you're vaping because it's an unregulated industry. And until Obama came out 3 months ago saying we will start to regulate it, the regulations haven't been written. It hasn't really started. But for those of us who ever walk into a gas station, right in front of you at height of a 14-year-old is all these vape products. And so we have schools where the vape level for high school seniors is running 60%. And a lot of those things have nicotine in it. So what did I just do? I just created somebody addicted to nicotine. How is that helpful to society, right? That's not a good thing. I don't think putting formaldehyde in your lungs is a particularly good idea. We don't have a lot of information on this stuff. In general, I don't think teenagers should be vaping anything. If I really was convinced that e-cigarettes gut you off of your other paper cigarettes, I'd probably be in favor of them, because I think paper cigarettes are really bad for you. But at this point, the studies in this country don't show that people quit. They just reduce their amount of paper cigarettes from a full pack to a half a pack, and then they vape on the in-between. But then I still have a half a pack a day smoker, right? That's still pretty unhealthy. What I really need to do is make them a non-smoker. Okay, let's talk about alcohol. 1/3 of us in this country drink 0. I used to use that as a minute, second, where I could catch up on running behind. And I'd be like, how much do you drink? Nothing. I'm like, okay, move on. And instead I say, why don't you drink? Tell me about that. Because there's often a story. And sometimes the story is it makes me sick. But often the story is my mom was a drop-down drunk and I hate the stuff. That's helpful for me to know that, right? It tells me a little bit of somebody's backstory. Or they'll say to me, I'm an alcoholic. And I'll think, boy, I actually never knew that. I've taken care of you for 10 years. I never knew you were an alcoholic. I never knew this about you. Really helpful for me to know that. 1/3 of us drink just a little bit. 1 to 2 drinks a month, or maybe a drink a week, a really light social drinker. And it leaves the final 1/3 of us in the country drinking all the rest of the alcohol. And in fact, the final 10% of us drink on average 10 drinks a day.
Say that again.
The final 10% of us drink on average 10 drinks a day. Now that doesn't seem possible. That seems crazy, 10 drinks a day. But let's talk about what a drink is, okay? A drink is a beer. A 12-ounce beer is a 12-ounce beer. Nobody's going to argue on that one. This is where things start to get tricky. So everybody who walks into my office, and I have some patients in the room, you tell me if I got this one wrong, but I will say to people, tell me about your relationship with alcohol. And people will then tell me about their relationship with alcohol. And women will say, oh, I have a couple glasses at night. And I'll say, oh yeah, what is it you're drinking? And they'll say, wine. And I'll say, uh-huh. And what is in a glass? Because I know what glasses look like these days, right? And I'm a woman. And I'm a working woman, which means I'm up at 5 doing laundry and walking the dog and responding to emails, and then I go working for 12 hours, and then I come home and my breakfast dishes and my kids, everything is a mess, and nobody started their homework, and I still have hours of work ahead of me, and I'm like, are you kidding me? And what do women do? They come home and they glug, glug, glug their bottle of wine. So I say to women, this is what an alcoholic beverage is for wine. It's 5 ounces. I need you to put 5 ounces in your wine goblet and acknowledge that line. You need to just look at what 5 ounces in your glass looks like, because it doesn't look like much. And then you need to stop and think to yourself, I'm actually, with every glass of wine I'm drinking, really having 3 or 4 glasses, which easily got you to 8 glasses of wine that day. Okay, so that's how you get to 10 so fast. Hard alcohol is 1.5 ounces. And for those of us who've been bartenders or mix our own drinks, very few people are measuring out their little 1.5 ounces. In fact, most of us are putting between 3 and 4 or 5 ounces of hard liquor into a mixed drink. That's where you get to 3. Okay, so the stuff adds up really, really fast. And the reason I target women in this conversation is because this has been a massive public health switch. In the old days, so I trained at Boston City Hospital. My dad trained at Boston City Hospital exactly 50 years before me. And he and I would laugh because the place really hadn't changed. It was full of poor people, which we loved, and it was full of poor people who were big drinkers, which my dad and I loved. We were really good. I could tap a belly from across the room. Like, we were experts at alcohol. The rates of alcoholism have always been a ratio of 9 men, 1 woman. Alcoholism is a man's disease. It's not largely a woman's disease. But in the last 15 to 20 years, it has now shifted, and the rates of alcoholism are running 6 to 3, men to women. It is hard to find anything in public health that has switched that fast. And why is that? It's this, right? Alcohol is targeted towards women, right? You're overwhelmed, you don't know what to do, mommy's time out, you go out with your girlfriends. Every woman drinks when they go out with their girlfriends. You know, the wine and canvas movement. You ever walk into a boutique, anytime you go in, there's like all those block lettered signs all about wine and chocolate too, wine and chocolate everywhere you go. Those aren't in like your sporting goods stores, right? Those are targeted to women. And so I'm just going to ask every person in the room just to self-acknowledge where you are with drinking, because walking in after a hard day at work and what your kids see is you glug, glug, glugging or going straight to the fridge and grabbing that 6-pack. What message are you sending to your kids? Because the message after a hard day at work should be that you walk in and say, man, I had a hard day. You want to go on a walk with me? I'm going to go sit down in the living room and I'm going to go stand in tree pose. Anybody want to do it with me? I have John Kabat-Zinn on my phone and I'm going to do the 10-minute sit-down meditation. Anybody else in? Because that is the role modeling our kids need to see about coping with stress and unhappiness and hating your job, right? And instead they watch us drink. Okay. Took me a while to get here, but we've done two things. We talked about genetics, we talked about early use, and then we talked about a whole bunch of other stuff. And now we're going to talk about trauma and what it does to people that makes them at risk for addiction. So the ACE study, who knows the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experience? Nicely done. What do you guys do in the back that you know this? Nice, I had that feeling. Who else? Therapy, is this a therapy group, behavioral health group back here?
We just learned about this at Fort River School, the whole staff.
Sweet, right? So I have an educator who knows this, which is an awesome thing. Okay, so this study came out in 2007, and it came out from Kaiser. Kaiser, everybody knows, western part of the United States. They do huge studies and really big healthcare, and they did it for one reason, or the lead author did it for one reason. He was trying to figure out if there's a relationship between massive adult obesity and childhood trauma, because we were taught that. When I was in residency in medical school, when I worked the gastric bypass clinics, the doctors would say, every woman you take care of will have had a history of sexual trauma. And I was like, really? And they were like, yep. And the truth is, they were largely right. But they never had really surveyed it before. So that's what the study's intention was. It asked 10 questions about what might have happened to you under the age of 18. 10 questions, yes or no. There's nothing I'm about to say that's inappropriate. I wanted students at this talk because I think our students should know these people are smart thinking people, but bad things happen to kids in lots of homes. And I'm going to run this quick list for you. I'm not going to read the whole thing. The print is tiny, and that's why I'm going to do it, because nobody else is going to see this. So some of the questions they might ask. Did a parent or another adult in the household often or very often swear at you, hit you, or leave marks or make you afraid that you might be physically hurt? Did a parent or another adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you? Were you ever sexually abused? Did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special? Or that your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? Did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you? Or that your parents were too drunk or too high to take care of you? Were your parents separated or divorced? Was there someone in your household with major mental illness? Was there somebody in your household who was incarcerated? There's a couple more. 10 questions, yes or no. And what they didn't expect about this study is what it meant in terms of overall health outcomes. This is a measure of trauma, of neglect, of household dysfunction. And if you score a 3 or a 4 or higher on an ACE score, you are more likely to die of asthma, heart attack. You are more likely to die 5 years earlier. You are more likely to have broken bones. You are more likely to have 30 or more sexual partners. The list went on and on. There was no chronic disease it did not predict for, with the exception of stroke and diabetes. Every other disease this predicted for. The two things it predicts for most intensely are the following: chronic pain. People who suffer with the disease of chronic pain often have a huge trauma history. And the second thing was addiction. Why? Right? You guys can answer it, right? It's not hard to figure it out. But when you are a 7-year-old and you're living in an unsafe household, or you're worried about your 4-year-old sister who's going to be abused by the stepfather in the house, or you're worried about finding your mom overdosed in the bathroom when you get back from school, or you're worried about breakfast tomorrow and dinner tonight because you're actively hungry all the time, you're a kid who's living in a high stress, high cortisol state all the time. That fear response in your body sets up every organ and every cell in your body for being this stressed out being that responds to everything by sort of self-soothing, by eating too many calories, by actually participating in behaviors that aren't healthy. And you live in so much psychological pain that you don't want to feel it anymore. And so you numb up. And you want to not feel anything more than drink too much and use drugs. And you'll check out, you'll numb up enough, right? So acknowledging trauma in our society is something we all have to get better at. And quite honestly, Amherst and Northampton have awesome treatment for trauma. Like, we're not living in the middle of nowhere. You want to find trauma therapists? You are in the Happy Valley and you have them. There's lots of parts of the state we have no trauma treatment, no ability to recognize trauma and actually get the right treatment for it, because trauma does not respond to talk therapy. It responds to different kinds of therapies. So, genetics plus trauma plus early use, you don't need all three. You could have just one. The message you want to send to your kids is to delay use or never use. I never say delay your use of cigarettes. I'm like, just don't ever smoke. It's a terrible habit. But I say to my own kids, and in fact, my alcohol is under lock and key in my house. As soon as they hit 12, I went to the hardware store and I locked it up. And I remember my oldest kid saying, "Do you not trust me?" And I was like, I trust you, kind of. I love you, but you're a teenager. And I anticipate that you're going to try to drink under my roof, and it will not happen, and none of your friends will drink under my roof either. And when I launched him off to college, I said, "Love, you're going to drink in college because that is what is expected, but I have taught you this stuff in and out." And he's like, "Mom, seriously, I know." And I'm like, no, let me finish. And the truth is that this kid I launched off into college, his first night of college was a night spent in the emergency room because he was hauling drop-down drunk kids to the emergency room. His first year of college spent 5 nights in the ER, right? Kid down, do I need to call 911 or can I get them there via Uber? Half went 911 with Ben, half went via Uber, overnight in the ER. Good lesson for my kid, right? You know, you want to help your teenagers, have them take CPR. Have them be like Red Cross certified. Have them feel responsible for other people around them. Have them know how to use Narcan. And tell them, you know what, if you have a kid who's doing badly, one of your jobs is to be the one of the kids to help protect them. What if we had that wall of people who didn't let the inebriated people up the stairs to be assaulted, right? I mean, that's part of the role that a lot of our kids can have. The kids who are standing at a party, either not drinking much or not drinking at all, keeping an eye out for everybody else. So I said this, alcohol use is down, actually with our kids, cigarettes is down, but really nothing is down with illicit drugs. And so your good principal alluded to this. Yeah, we have an opiate problem. I'm not going to say I think Amherst has a huge opiate pill problem. I am going to say I think the entire eastern part of our country has a huge heroin problem. And we're going to cover parts of the country that have a massive pill problem right now. I am, if you said, what is your specialty? I'm a family doctor. I take care of pregnant women and babies, and I'm a reproductive health specialist. I could put an IUD in anybody. I already told you I could tap a belly. And I came out here from Boston. I grew up out here, actually. And I said, who's taking care of people with addiction? And they're like, nobody. And I thought, what? What's up? That's our job. We're all supposed to be doing it. And so I ended up taking care of a lot of people with addiction. And one morning, every morning, I get up, I read the newspaper, and I obsessively read the obituaries, not because I'm morbid or I have low dopamine, but because I'm a family doctor in a small community and my patients die, and I need to know who died because I need to call family. And in the morning of December of 2011, that young woman in that red jacket on the upper left, her name is Ashley Sims, was in the obituaries. And it said, Ashley Sims, age 21, died of a heroin overdose at home. And I thought, I know Ashley, I know her grandmothers. And I called them and I said, I can't believe Ashley died. And then not much longer, I said, and I'm so grateful you told the truth about how Ashley died. Because for a while, we'd all been reading in the papers about young people dying unexpectedly at home. And I really think that for the most part, unless you read about a motor vehicle accident the day before, people who die unexpectedly at home are either a suicide or they're an overdose. That's not 100% true, but it's true a lot of the time. And more people are telling the truth about how their loved ones have died because we're trying to decrease the stigma and the shame about this disease. So the front page of the Recorder for years now has been focused on today's current addiction problem, not just to opiates, but addiction in general, and acknowledging the disease and the role it plays in our society. The cover of Time magazine last summer said, painkillers are on the hook for this current epidemic. We created this problem. I am a believer that doctors overprescribed opiates for a good 20 years, and we need to pull back, and we need to acknowledge that a certain percent of people will get addicted, and we have to treat them with their disease of addiction, not their disease of chronic pain. It's a complicated discussion. Having said that, and I'm not going to torture you guys because I know it's getting late, but you know, everything about the treating chronic pain all the time with as much opiates as possible is based on one study that came out of Sloan Kettering in 1985, and it had 38 patients in it. So more people struggle with the disease of chronic pain than cancer, heart disease, and diabetes combined And I have a study looking at 38 patients looking at how well opiates work. So that is a major mismatch between need and science, right? And it's crazy, but the entire pharmaceutical industry talked about this study obsessively. And in this study, where they actually screened out all people who could potentially be high risk to develop an addiction, they already screened them out, which is not what the average person out there did. Only 2 people out of 38 got addicted. And somehow that became 1%, again, math not working, but that's where they came up with this line that only 1% of people given an opiate would get addicted, right? Crazy. So the more we prescribed opiates starting in 1990 something, the more people died of deaths from opiates and the more people entered treatment for opiate addiction, right? A kindergartner in 1990 something could have drawn this graph. It is 100% predictable. When I asked my dad, who was a doctor out here, how many times, Dad, did you write for an opiate prescription? He said, what's an opiate? He was a primary care doctor. And I was like, seriously, come on, Dad. Like Percocet, oxycodone. He was like, I don't know. I mean, like 5? My dad was in practice out here for 35 years. I thought to myself, I have written 5 scripts for an opiate by 8 every morning. In this graph, this is a bar graph that looks at 10 years between the year 2000 and 2010. And the negative bar graphs off to the left is where we have reduced death. Okay? And the ones on the upper right is where we've increased death in that 10-year time. This is where we've reduced death. We have dropped a death by aortic aneurysm by 34%. Why is that? Did somebody say smoking? Oh. Smoking is the answer. Surgery is not the answer. The surgeons want that to be the answer. That's not the answer. Our surgeries haven't gotten any better or faster at fixing them. I mean, if you find a AAA before it ruptures in time, you'll save somebody. The reason AAAs don't rupture is fewer people are smoking. And when you don't smoke, you're less likely to develop an aneurysm or have it rupture. So again, public health measure, that's what really works. What I do in my office doesn't work so well. So why are motor vehicle accident deaths down? Seatbelts. Safer cars and seatbelts, absolutely. Why are deaths by flu and pneumonia down? Vaccines and pneumonia, shots, they're awesome. That's right, okay. In all that top area, I know nobody can see this stuff. These are where deaths have increased. Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, end-stage renal disease. Do we have an epidemic of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's? Everybody lives until they're 98 years old these days, right? Everybody, I mean, I tell you, when I read the obituaries and it says a 79-year-old died, I'm like, oh, they're so young. What could have killed them, right? It's crazy. We are going to live forever, and that is what it is for some of us, and I think that's not so great. So when I'm left filling out the obituary at 99, I'm like, I don't know, I've been taking care of her for the last 10 years. She's never known who I was. Oop, Alzheimer's, right? Because more and more people are living longer. Most every area up there of increased death has to do with the fact that we live forever, okay? There's 2 exceptions to that, and that is suicides have gone up, and that's what all the data shows, that since 2008, white middle-class Americans are dying more, and the reasons for that are addiction either to alcohol, opiates, or suicide. And then that top line is a 278% death by opiate overdose. This is data that only goes to 2010. If we ran the data now in 2016, that would be like a 775% increase by death by opiates. And the reason I like this graph is it puts it in relationship to all the other diseases out there. And it really holds people like me who write prescriptions responsible for this current problem and responsible for not responding to the current problem. Because if you go into your primary care doctor and you look them in the eye and say, are you helping people with addiction? Do you do addiction work in your practice? They're going to say no to you. They are, because very few people do this work. So when you look at the country, that top map is the year 1999. Those red areas on that top map are places where people are dying from drug overdose. So on that map, you see the beginning of Appalachia start to light up. That's like West Virginia, Kentucky, and some parts of Tennessee. You see the northern part of New Mexico light up. 5 years go by, we're now at 2004, that's the middle map there, and you see a lot more red, right? The red is starting to spread. 5 more years go by and you get to 2008, 2009, so 4 years go by. Look how much of the country is now red, right? And this is just the spread of the overdose epidemic. And again, this is 2009, nothing like we have had in the last 3 years. The thing is, the entire country is red, and we can't even use this data anymore. Like, I think everybody knows that, but 79 people every day in this country are dying of death by opiate overdose. 79 people. That's a big number, and these are young, healthy people. Okay, so I think people know this, that a lot of the meds that came to this, the New England region, the pills actually, although I take the entire blame of the opiate epidemic on myself, the truth is I'm actually a really good prescriber. I teach people about chronic pain and how to safely prescribe. I train doctors all over New England on the subject. The vast majority of pills that came to New England came to us from Florida, up the Oxy Highway of I-95. And back in the day, there were over 600 pain clinics in Florida, and you would go to any strip mall and there'd be a pain clinic there, and people would send tour buses from Kentucky and Maine down there, and they would say, hey, you get 2 free nights in a hotel and pay for all your meals. You just have to go to 2 pain clinics a day and ask for your meds. You don't need a limp, you don't need a cane. You could look just like that, tell them you have a migraine, and you'll get your meds. And so you would go there and you would get on that bus and you would have your bag of pills and your prescriptions, because the definition of a pill mill is that you could both write a script and dispense the drug. They were like pharmacist, doctor, people all in one setting. It was crazy. So in 2010, the federal government said to Florida, we will shut off all federal funding to your state. No education money, no highway money until you get this problem under control, because you're destroying our country. Then Florida was like, whoops, we got a problem here. And so 80 doctors had their licenses suspended, whatever, but there's 39 of them who very rightly are in jail for being drug dealers. And they were making tens of millions of dollars off of this industry. So the problem is when you shut down all those pill mills and all of our pain pills that were flooding our area, what was left for us? What was going to take over? Right, of course it was. And if you think that the Mexican cartels weren't watching everything we were doing, they were ready. They had mowed over their marijuana fields 2 or 3 years ahead of this. They had been planting poppies, getting ready for us to shut down our pill mills. We have the best heroin available. It's awesome stuff. It's getting better and better these days, in fact. And I know I seem light. I deal with this all day long now, but it's the stuff is incredibly potent and it's incredibly cheap. Top graph is how pure it is. The bottom graph is how cheap it is. So it's gotten more pure and it's gotten cheaper and cheaper. And now they cut it with fentanyl, which is incredibly cheap. It gets manufactured in China. It gets shipped over here through New Jersey. They cut it right in. And I'm living in a world now where I no longer ask the question, how many bags of heroin are you injecting a day? I say, tell me how much straight fentanyl you're using. Because from a treatment angle, it's like fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more potent than heroin. And have that person walk into your detox center actively withdrawing. I'm using doses of meds I didn't know were possible, right? It's insane, but people are injecting 150 bags of fentanyl every day and somehow staying alive. This thing is not, I mean, again, I could talk all night and I won't do that to you. This is no longer about the pills. And so for our elected officials to be endlessly self-congratulatory about the cut down of pills, that horse is long out of the barn, right? That was a 4-year-ago problem. I don't have a pill problem anymore. I have a straight heroin and fentanyl problem. And until I get somebody focusing on that and focusing on how we're going to get rapid treatment for people before they die, I'm not so interested in hearing about how we have improved our prescribing patterns in this state. Again, 4 years ago, I would have perked up my ears on that problem. So when you ask the average EMS worker, what's your number 1 drug of abuse? Those dark green areas, the answer is heroin. So what's up with the Southeast? Why aren't they lit up with heroin? The answer is not meth. Meth is on the down right now, thank God for that one. And there's not tons of meth in the Southeast. The answer is this. Those dark purple states are states where on average there was between 1 bottle and 1.5 bottles of opiates given per person in that state. So those are states that are still full of pill bottles, full of prescription opiates that doctors are writing. Those are those dark purple states. So as you can imagine, if the bright red states, which is our area, is filled with heroin, bright red on this map is heroin. If you can imagine now that the CDC has come down with their guidelines, meaning the federal government is now involved in how we prescribe, those dark purple states are going to become red states in the next 2 years. This is me talking here, but my predictions so far aren't so far off, right? I've been at this business now actively for 3 years now, and we've been watching this thing unfold. So if you think the states, fine states of Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana are building methadone clinics and training all their doctors to get good at addiction and putting Narcan in every state trooper car, if you think that's happening in those states, then I think you're wrong. It's not happening. And what I predict is we're going to have tens and tens of thousands of deaths by heroin overdose in the next 2 to 3 years in the Southeast. And if they would just look up and see what's happening us in the Northeast, they would be preparing themselves for this onslaught. So our young people get exposed to opiates in a handful of ways. First of all, most of our kids are not using prescription opiates. A very, very small percent actually use them. The problem is that lots and lots of our teenagers are using marijuana. Lots, right? As much as 35%, sometimes 40%, depending on the school, in the last 30 days have used marijuana. And I'm not going to get into some complicated Reagan discussion about gateway drug. What I'm going to remind you of is that any addictive substance has an impact on the developing brain. And it is very rare for me to meet somebody who's actively struggling with heroin who did not say, yeah, I had a major problem with marijuana. Does that mean everybody who uses marijuana is going to move to heroin? I don't believe that, right? But if I had somebody who had the genetic predisposition, who had any history of trauma, and was trying to quiet down their insomnia and their anxiety with marijuana, that is a person who I'd be like, dude, we need to get you help now. We need to pull you back before you keep going this pathway of trying to get more and more numb. So our teenagers get exposed to opiates in the following ways. They get injured, athletic injury, right? Femur break, ACL tear playing soccer, girl, right? These things happen. And as a parent, what I would say, or the other one is wisdom teeth. The wisdom teeth get taken out at 18. And when I look at a prescriber who has my kid in a chair and I see their pen hovering above a prescription pad, as a parent, what I would say to them is, what can I do to protect my kid's developing brain from an opiate exposure? How can I manage their pain post-surgically with as little opiate as possible? Tell me how to do that. Because if it were me you were asking, I would say, okay, let's talk about the combination of Motrin and Tylenol, exactly how much to use and how to dose it. And I'm going to use a long-acting injectable lidocaine that lasts 36 hours in the operating room, even though it costs $300 more, because it's the right thing to do. And I'm your oral surgeon, and I actually am going to write you for 4 pills, because when you ask the average post-wisdom tooth person or root canal, how many of your pain pills did you really use? How many of us use 30 of anything, right? And I've asked this question, tens of thousands of people now I've asked this question, you know, like how many of your pain pills after an oral surgery did you really use? And most people say 0, 2, 4, every now and then I get a 6. Is that fair? Did anybody use a lot more than that? So why are they writing scripts for 30? Ever? Now you can walk into the pharmacy and say, don't give me 30, give me 6. Now the other 24 are wasted, you won't be able to go back and get them. But if you're suffering 3 days later, call your oral surgeon and get some more. And tell him, I only took 6 because I thought that was all I need. Give me 2 now. I've trained the dentist and the oral surgeon, said stop prescribing so many, because those end up in a medicine cabinet, and then who gets them? The 15-year-olds get them, or the next door neighbor gets them. That's what you don't want. So if you have any pills in your house, Xanax, Valium, painkillers that you held on for a rainy day, get them the hell out of your house or keep them under lock and key and bring them back to a drug take-back box. They do not belong in your house. So these are things you might find in your kid's room or somebody you love's room if they're struggling. And what I want to believe about myself and my own kids is I want to be able to find them about 3 months into the game or sooner. I don't want to be the parent who figures it out 2 years in, which is what happens most of the time for me. So I walk through my kid's room and I look for stuff, and I'm not crazy. I don't do their laundry, I don't clean their room. I hate walking into the room because they disgust me, but I look for things that are worrisome to me. Anything that you could snort through, rolled up dollar bills, straws, inside of a broken pen. My kids break pens all the time. Like I have a son who likes to take them apart. He chews them. It makes me crazy because what he doesn't see my brain working, which is why am I seeing all these insides of pens, right? So anyway, he and I talk about it. So any pill bottle, right? If I'm finding Motrin, Tylenol, or Benadryl in my kid's room, I'm like, hello, you don't get to self-dose your own Benadryl. You shouldn't be taking Benadryl. If you're having trouble sleeping, come talk to me. Let's get a plan for that, right? You have your period cramps. I don't want you dosing yourself 12 times a day with Tylenol. It's one of the #1 causes of liver failure in girls is they're like period cramps, and before you know it, they're at 10,000 milligrams of Tylenol, right? And they're in liver failure. Not okay. Most adults can't manage their own medicine. Your kids should not be managing their own medicine. So my kids have a rule. They have a headache, they actually have to come talk to me or my husband and say, I have a headache, I was going to take some Motrin. Should I take 1 or 2? And I'm like, you can take 2, and then they go and get it, right? But I don't want pills in their room. There shouldn't be any pills. Little baggies, those little glassine baggies, unless your kid is a beater and they're filled with beads, no baggies in kids' rooms. They shouldn't be there. And when I have a parent bring their kid in and they said, my kid is struggling big time, I think they're using heroin, I'm like, go home, clean out their room, get every stick of furniture, every article of clothing, empty the room out. And they come back next week and I'm like, what'd you find? Tens of thousands of those little plastic baggies. You got to get rid of them because they have a little tiny bit of powder and people are desperate and they will keep using whatever they can find. No straight edge razors, no knives in your kid's room. I know that seems like a stupid thing, But kids cut themselves. Kids do self-injurious behavior because they're feeling miserable. So I go through my kids' room and I make sure those things are not in there. In the average kid who's struggling with a addiction to an injectable drugs, this is the stuff you're going to find. Parents will say to me, we were going through bags and bags of cotton balls or Q-tips every week. Ask yourself the last time you bought a bag of cotton balls. I don't know. I can't remember. Probably 2 years ago. Like, we don't use a lot of cotton balls. But if my kids started asking for a lot of cotton balls or Q-tips because they use it as filters for the drug, that's a warning sign. Bottles of bleach or vinegar to clean the works. Your kids are not washing their windows in their rooms, right? So these are warning signs that those of us who have kids who've struggled, boy, we wish we had known them earlier. Okay, and again, I look like I'm a crazy parent, but if I found burnt foil in my house or a bent spoon, you should absolutely freak out, because that's a warning sign of I need to pay a hell of a lot of attention. And maybe they had a baked potato on the fire pit last night, and that gives you burnt foil. There's a good reason right there. But otherwise, there's no burnt foil in your house. Why would there be burnt foil in your house, right? It's a way to cook down the drug. So again, I want to be the mom who knows my kid is struggling 3 months in, because 3 months is a big difference than 2 years in terms of how well they're likely to do with treatment. So, and I want to be clear, you know, I'm a well-educated, in a relationship, stable household. I presume my kids are at as high a risk of developing an addiction as anybody else out there, right? Just because you guys live in Amherst doesn't protect you. Narcan, if you have somebody you love, you should have Narcan in your life. Amherst High School has Narcan? Yes. Thank you, ma'am. Every high school in Massachusetts, every high school in the country should have Narcan, because the likelihood of somebody dying of an anaphylactic shock from being exposed to a peanut is certainly, there's a chance of that. We got plenty of EpiPens, right? But the likelihood of a staff member, a custodian, or a kid being in an active struggle with an opiate addiction and us not knowing, and having that person go down and Robin not be able to save that kid's life. I mean, granted, EMS would be here in 5 minutes, I know that, but 5 minutes not breathing, that's not okay. Robin has the ability, were she not to have 950 kids under her watch, to save somebody's life, because she has Narcan in this building, and every school should have that. These are great books. If you haven't read, or maybe you've read every one of these books, if you are interested in that concept of trauma and you want to learn more either for your work, either in the schools or in your own work, The Body Keeps the Score is the best book of trauma I've ever read in my life. Who has read that book? It's a beautiful book. He's a beautiful writer. He's very engaging. Do you disagree with that? Maybe you don't love him. Okay, I love that book. For me, it helps me clinically. It helps me help my patients a lot. Has anybody read the book Beautiful Boy? How painful was that book to read? Do you have kids?
Yeah, it's hard.
Oh, it's so hard. It's about a dad. He's a wonderful writer and a journalist whose son develops a drug addiction, and he just chronicles it. And it's terrifying and horrifying. I couldn't sleep at night.